Okay, I think without further ado, I will actually throw the first question of the evening at you guys. Why do we actually need to know what Russians really think? Why do we need to understand the war according to Russians?
Okay. Well, I think what perhaps brings us all together in why we do what we do as researchers is because we share a view that often the situation in countries like Russia that are more or less termed authoritarian states is often very dumbed down, even in the best British media. And certainly what I'm trying to do in this book here is show that there is quite a lot of vibrant politics from below, that is driven by ordinary people who want to improve their country, regardless of the war on Ukraine, and that this is important. And at some point in the future, whatever we think of the way Russia is today will change. Putinism, dictatorship, which again may be the part of the title of Ilya's book that he's writing at the moment. Dictatorship will end. It will be replaced by something else. We need to know whether there might be a very short political opening, whether there might be a period of prolonged infighting and chaos, and more importantly, whether or not ordinary people can really step up and come together, perhaps diverse groups of ordinary people, step up, make a difference, and perhaps prevent the cycle of history repeating itself in Russia, which tends to end quite badly when it does repeat itself. Over to you, Ilya.
I think the answer is very simple. We constantly hear what the elites are saying, right? What the establishment, what the Kremlin source this, source says this, the Kremlin source says that, or what the elite media are publishing in Russian about Russia. And it's a top-down approach, which is absolutely fair. This is what I do. But even in this approach, when the top-down approach is in making, is in action, we can find a lot of interesting caveats. We can find a lot of interesting, very unobvious things that drive the Russian system. So, for instance, I've been doing a lot of research in Russian media, especially amongst Russian journalists, state-employed journalists, sort of semi-private companies, but the companies that are actually owned by people close to the government, private companies. And I started this research many years ago, and I wanted to know how the news are made, because there were, back in the day, in 2010s, there were a lot of myths about how Russian media actually function. And I was surprised, because the cliche was, there are blacklists, there are measures of censorship in the Russian media, and that's how they work. Basically, someone in the Kremlin or whatever, the presidential administration, gives a call to the media, and they decide to stop publishing the material, which sometimes happens. But when I started interviewing journalists, editors-in-chief, both state-led media, private media, what I realized it was actually self-censorship. That's what was driving the media, right? But the picture that we are getting from the media or from scholars, right, from mainstream scholars, is that, that's how Russia's dictatorship, it's so easily explained. But even now, it's so important to try to identify those voices, those small areas in the society from where we can get kind of objective information.
Actually, just because you said this thing about top-down and censorship, this reminds me of the book How Russia Really Works, which kind of makes
really
really works, which makes exactly this point that everything is controlled from the top. And I think that while you guys were talking, I was actually thinking about that. The other thing is that in the West, there's so much interest in what Putin really thinks. Yeah. And Putin as the instigator of the war, and the kind of fascination with the figure of Putin. And that is just far too narrow, apart from the fact that we do not know what Putin really thinks. And it's much more interesting to actually try to understand what Russians think, how Russians live in this kind of particular society, which is like a society with its own problems, of course, but also which is not quite as homogenized and passive as we are often presented with. And so basically, I think, Jeremy, that is my next question for you already, which is, what do we actually mean when we talk about the Russian public and Russian public opinion? And also, can we even research it, especially now in times of war?
Yeah, so this is something that I've been kind of battling about in the Twitter waves and beyond this book, because I'm firmly in the camp that says that if you take a society where there can really be no public dissent, there can't really be public opinion, because ordinary people know that their expression of a preference, a political preference, has no meaning in that system, right? So elections are more or less completely a foregone conclusion, so people know that their votes don't count. And so for a long time, even before the war started, before the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and also because of the preference that I have for these much softer methods where I go and I immerse myself for an extended period of time in a community, get to know various people from different walks of life, talk to them in a more disarming and less pressured way about, what do you feel about what this guy, we don't mention his name, this guy has done for the country? What do you think about the big man? And people, of course, then provide a much more nuanced and quite contradictory answer very often. So my view has always been that, especially in quote unquote non-democratic societies, public opinion polling is a very limited value. Of course, it can tell us some things, and especially if it's done carefully and sensitively. But even in our own societies, look at some of the elections that we've had in the UK, that we've had in the US, and opinion polling has really badly failed to even predict something very simple like one American politician versus another American politician. So that's fundamentally how I think about opinion polling. And I wanted to also say on your point about what Putin thinks, this is also, for those of you that don't follow kind of this rather academic argument that we have between us in what's called political science or sociology, political sociology, there is also, unfortunately, a kind of unhealthy obsession with psychologizing Putin, and it generally leads to a blind alley because, as you said, Stefanie, you can't know what he thinks. And does it even matter? Of course, I would argue that it does matter in that he himself, with a very small circle of crazy boomer uncles, started the invasion, right? So they almost meme themselves into thinking, yeah, we could do this, because also partly because of his physical isolation during COVID, right? He was in a bunker. So certainly there is a very, very small role to play for psychologizing, but we are where we are. And as you said, Ilya, the point is that Russia is far more diverse, and the spectrum of opinion and desire, social desires, political desires, is much, much bigger than we normally are led to believe.
But even from a simple research point of view, you got one guy who sits in the Kremlin. What are the ways that you can objectively get to him and extract information, right? Given his KGB background, right? At the same time, you have millions of people to whom you can get access. And in the era of digital communication, you can try and extract the data that can give you some sort of a real picture of what's going on. I'm not even mentioning social media listening and that kind of instruments, right? Or more obvious, again, something I'm working on, but I don't know, if you're on Telegram and if you read Russian, there's this guy, Ivan Filipov, who is doing the kind of review of the so-called military correspondents. So he scans the channels of those guys who are actually at the front line or supplying the front line with some various items and how they describe what's happening.
So these are channels on Telegram. He's kind of summarizing them all.
Yeah. So it's called Na Zapadnom fronte без перемен. And it's quite interesting because every day he publishes what small and medium-sized channels are actually saying about the situation on the front line. And every time there is something in the Russian media say, oh, we've captured this spot and we are advancing here and there, then he said, well, that's the guy. We have made the OSINT on him, so open source intelligence. He's doing this work. He's been doing this work for several months, so we can trace what he's doing and what he's writing about it. certainly there was a lot of censorship and self-censorship after Prigozhin's mutiny in 2023. But still, what he shows is actually speaks much more about that particular community of people, right? But then again, try to be more creative and speak to the ordinary people in Russia, and you will hear a lot of difficult things, a lot of problematic things. At the same time, you will hear a lot of interesting things that can give you some ideas, kind of insights.
Jeremy, just following on from this notion of self-censorship that Ilya mentioned, self-censorship, of course, goes on in authoritarian societies.
Yeah,
and not only authoritarian societies.
I was just going to say that, not only in authoritarian societies, it's actually something that is kind of very widespread. If you kind of think about Western media, for example, during the Cold War and the way they reported about like sort of certain issues like Vietnam famously was one of those breaks in self-censorship in American media, where for one, this was the first time I think that Americans heard about atrocities committed by American troops, because before that there had been self-censorship about that. So it's a widespread issue. And I wanted to ask you, Jeremy, like sort of in terms of the kind of society that Russia is, in terms of the difficulties of researching the public and public opinion, how much self-censorship is an issue when you do ethnographic research, and like sort of, and how you actually go about trying to overcome this?
And that's a great question, and it also then relates to what Ilya just said about how, you know, there's a massive potential in analyzing social media. But for me, I do look at, well, what I often do is I meet somebody, I interact with somebody personally, I build up a long-term ethnographic relationship with them. They become what we call an interlocutor, because we don't like to use the term informant because of the connotations that it has nowadays. So like I have all these interlocutors who I know in real life, and I've been very privileged that I've been able to travel and do research in Russia for many, many years. And even since the war began, I did travel to Russia to connect with people. I thought I had a kind of duty to do that. But this is where the question of self-censorship comes in, because I would argue, again, this is another reason why we can't trust opinion polling, because just imagine you're telephoned on your mobile phone by a polling company in Russia, and you agree to a survey, and the surveyor says, okay, so we want to talk about the special military operation in Ukraine, which is what it's called, obviously, right? We want to know whether or not you support the actions of the Russian armed forces. Now, they're calling you on your mobile phone, which is registered with the government, right? Where every single communication, and Ilya is more of an expert on this than I am, every single communication can be logged and recorded. Of course you're going to say that you support the military operation in Ukraine, regardless of your opinion. So that's the first basic element of self-censorship. But for me, obviously, in my work, I'm going there, having these long conversations, which generally, I'm not going to start a political conversation. Even 10 years ago, I'm not going to start an overtly political conversation about, in those days, it was the annexation of Crimea, right? That's more than 10 years ago now. But especially not now, because, of course, I could inadvertently lead somebody to say something that is effectively criminalized speech, right? If they say something against the war. But what I would say is that self-censorship is now increasingly and everyday a part of everyday life for Russians, even ones that more or less are happy with the status quo, maybe. They may be happy with the government, they may be happy with Putin, they maybe don't really care about the war, right? And let's face it, in any society, there are going to be a mass of people who are pretty indifferent to foreign policy, even if it indirectly affects their livelihood. However, I think that the atmosphere of criminalizing all kinds of speech has this effect that people are just being really, really careful what they say, regardless of their actual political beliefs, which makes it, again, even more difficult to find really, really good methods to dig down and get at this question of, what politics means for ordinary people. And certainly something that I've been kind of increasingly having to engage with is how to deal with people who are afraid when you're doing this kind of immersive work, right, which involves personal relationships, and you can see that people are afraid. But I would also then say that's the advantage of this ethnographic method that I use, in that I'm talking to people generally that I've built a relationship with. I can then just, by looking at their demeanor, how they interact with me over a long period of time, kind of notice that change, and then myself articulate it in my writing. Say, well, yeah, this is Joe Bloggs, and he 10 years ago, he would complain about the government on this topic. 10 years ago, he would talk about voting. And now, now he's like completely changed. He won't talk about anything. He's gone into a shell. He talks about these other topics. Or again, when it comes to, and this is also a story that's in this book, people that after Crimea was annexed in 2014, again, it's reported it's kind of almost become part of kind of common sense in the way academics look at that moment in Russian politics. Say, this is where Putin and the Russian people came together, and they were really, really happy as never before with the Putin's leadership, and it really built a sense of Russian national identity. Crimea had, in many Russians' views, come home, because many Russian people, and this is again the common sense, believed that it had been unfairly or unjustly awarded to Ukraine during the Soviet period. So Crimea had come home, and they were really thankful to Putin about that. And that's what you can read in pretty much any book or academic article written about the annexation of Crimea in 2014. But my work then is sit down over a summer barbecue with my guys, cracking a couple of beers open, frying some fish, Russian style, and they start to speak really ironically about this in a way that really shows how there's a kind of double meaning to this Crimean moment. Because then one of them starts to say, well, actually, yeah, now we've got 2.5 million new Russian citizens. Who's going to pay their pensions? It's going to be Muggins here, the guy says, right? He's just what the Americans say, Joe Sixpack. He's just an ordinary guy trying to make his way through life. And while he'll start by saying, yeah, I'm really glad that we've annexed Crimea, the Ukrainians had it coming to them, blah, 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 the West is against us, all these kind of things that we hear that are repetitions in part of Russian media. Mm-hmm. But then through prolonged interaction with these people in a kind of trusting environment, all this kind of very contradictory stuff comes out, which is like, yeah, it's really, really unfair that we're going to have to pay for this. This is like this foreign policy adventure that Putin suddenly decided was a good idea. We've got 2.5 million new people in our country. Who's going to pay for their pensions, right? Who's going to find them jobs? Who's going to pay for the infrastructure? Because Crimea had very, very poor infrastructure in comparison to the rest of the region. So that just gives you a kind of flavor of how you can use these kind of methods, I think, to really provide a much more granular and sometimes counterintuitive take on the way people feel about politics.
I would make 2 notes on self-censorship. We might think about self-censorship as a kind of punishment. But in my work on Russian media professionals, both inside Russia and after 22 with those in exile, self-censorship can be creative. And that is something that is quite scary. But again, from 2014, we see a huge crackdown on independent media. We see the first media outlets that emerge abroad and start operating from abroad to the Russian audiences. And from my work with state media, when I've spotted that there is this thing in Russian called adekvatность, right? So we've defined it as the creative type of self-censorship where those people that produce media content, they actually know what they're doing and they know the borders, but the limits of where they should stop their creativity, they're not written anywhere. So there are no guidelines, at least before 2022. There were no clear censoring laws, right? After 22, everything changed. Everything's changed around 1 month. In March 2022, the state parliament introduced all kinds of censorship laws. Before that, it's about you being creative, right? So all those absolute disinformation masterpieces from 24 masterpieces, quote unquote, from the Donbass that were broadcast by Channel 1 or Channel 2, which are in every textbook about the crucified boy of 3 years old, right? These were creative things by the staff in the newsroom because they know they had to do something entertaining, right? Because television and media, it's also about the money. It's about the ratings. It's about the audiences. So we need to keep audiences entertained. Doesn't matter that the state gives us this money.
And right? Outraged, right? Because again, that's outrage as well. Outrage bait.
Yeah.
So the Ukrainians crucified this child which of course is obviously not true,
Right.
was this beginning of outrage baiting, but also complete, not even disinformation, but propaganda.
It was a piece of disinformation, but instead of approaching it in a very sort of direct way, it is the Kremlin that ordered this, right? When we go into the newsroom and we actually start asking people like Ovsyannikov, for example, so who did that, right? They would say, well, it's the creativity of these guys, because then they kind of, it went viral, and then they understood in the newsroom that actually that is the stuff that people buy, and then we're going to produce more of that, and therefore the bosses are going to like that too. They're going to promote those people. So you see there's a lot of financial incentives.
So what you're saying is that the disinformation becomes creative and then has a life of its own.
It is creative.
That is completely independent of what the Kremlin wants or doesn't want.
Again, there are things that are decided and sort of channeled into the newsroom from the presidential administration. But a lot of this is actually the creation of people in the newsrooms.
You said there was a real distinction between pre-2022 and post-2022.
Yeah.
So is what you're describing a dynamics that was prevalent before 2022?
Yeah, because then after 2022, I want to say something about completely different, right? It is about exiled media, because the financial incentive, the career incentive is very important, right? Because all the media that are state-led in Russia, they also exist in the capitalist market, right? So they are competing for the audiences.
For like ads, right?
Yeah, because
there are ads on all channels, right?
Yeah, sure, yeah. But then, so let's change the focus. When I'm saying self-censorship, it could be creative, right? Self-censorship could also be found amongst the exiled media that operate in democratic settings, right? They left Russia and they work for specific audiences inside Russia, right? A lot of the exiled media claim that most of our audiences is inside Russia, right? So, but they are based in Europe. So we might assume that they also operate without self-censorship. Why would they self-censor themselves if they are not based inside Russia, right? There are no laws. But there is a question of entertainment. There is a question of biases that the audience has. There's also a matter of algorithms and what makes certain videos viral. So you're not going to create a complex message, right? You will try to dumb it down to something very simple. Putin is bad, Putin is going to die tomorrow, versus Russia, whatever, right? So, and they're going to challenge it. But then when you ask them, like, why are you dumbing it down, right? Why are you turning it into a tabloid? They would say, A, we need revenues from clickbait, we need audiences, and we need donors, right? And if we say something somewhat positive about what's happening in Russia, we might lose donors.
That's often a criticism, isn't it, that's directed at the Russian media in exile, that it's unrelentingly negative about what's happening in Russia to the extent that it's almost bordering on, again, not disinformation, but being very misleading to its own audience outside Russia.
But then there is another problem. These guys in exile are broadcasting to Russia, and when the Russian audiences are listening to what these guys in exile are saying about their life, they say, we don't want to do this. We don't want to listen to them. We don't want to consume.
Well, they don't recognize it either, do they? Because if from outside you're saying everything's terrible, this is like a Mordor. These people are living in Mordor, right? And then you're consuming that as a Russian in Russia, and you're like, well, yeah, okay, things aren't perfect, but we don't recognize this reality. You're not going to then trust this media that you guys are funding, by the way, as UK taxpayers.
Okay, but this kind of, I think, gets me to the question that I'm sure lots of people have come for, which is, what do Russians actually think? And because you have kind of now given us some glimpses of that the official narrative might not be what people really think. The Kremlin myth it's quite interesting that there's in some ways a really weird alignment between what the Kremlin says the Russians think and what Western analysts often say that Russians think. So that's actually quite problematic, which is basically the myth of all Russians supporting this war, that there's a homogeneity. And basically that is something that the Kremlin wants to push as a narrative. And it's something that Western kind of media often push. And I think we are here to kind of basically unpick that a little bit.
Sure.
With all of the caveats about how we actually can know what Russians think in this particular moment. Because as you also mentioned, now there is real censorship, right, in the media. Now, after 2022, I mean, like sort of our audience might not be entirely aware of that, but basically laws have been passed, and now, like sort of, if you deviate from the line, you do really risk prison. And like sort of the clampdown has been very, very hard. But it needs to be understood that that is also a new thing. Yeah. Russia wasn't, before 2022, was not the kind of society where you couldn't say anything. It was not like sort of Stalin's Soviet Union, but now it is really become very, very different. And I mean, Jeremy has done some research in this very difficult new context. What do you think that Russians really think?
Well, again, this is the question that this book tries to answer. And despite what I said about distrusting opinion polling, I do start with, well, let's actually look at this time before the full-scale war, where the stakes were much lower in asking people survey questions, right? And so there were and there are people in Russia, in sociological kind of institutes, that do this kind of research where they go, again, in person to a focus group, like a room like this, and kind of ask people what their priorities are. What how would you like to see your country in 10 years' time? How would you like to see the circumstances of your family in 5-10 years' time? And there are also measures of, what are your 5 fears in the next year? What are you most afraid of for you and your family that's going to happen in the next year, in the next 5 years? What do you think makes you proud to be a Russian? Right? So these are much more open questions. And so when people are doing that kind of research, I sit up and take notice. And again, what's interesting before the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022 is that Ukraine was just not something that Russian people were interested in. So again, this is the first clue about how we should challenge this narrative that Russian people are hugely aligned, are very closely aligned with the foreign policy objectives of their leadership, right? Which clearly are obsessed with the Ukrainian question. Now, this idea that, Ukraine shouldn't have its own statehood, that most Ukrainians would be better off somehow in this so-called Russian world, right? That is the viewpoint of, at least part of the viewpoint, and this is something that Stefanie has worked on much more than me. This is at least part of the mindset of the elite. But then when we go back to before the war started, and you may trust survey data more than you trust me, but if we look at survey data, nobody cared about the Ukrainian issue, even after Crimea had happened. Yeah, it was very, very small in terms of, if you ask the average Russian, what are the big issues in your life? What are the big issues for our country? Ukraine really isn't there. What is there, of course, is the bread and butter of any country that's going through severe economic problems, demographic transition in a much more extreme way that we're experiencing in the West, but still has similarities, right? So it's things like really, really bad inequality. So Russia is one of the most unequal, high human development countries in the world. We used to say rich countries, but we can't say that anymore. So we'll say high human development countries, right?
Just at some point, like sort of, I think the most millionaires in the world were in Moscow at some point.
Yeah. So it's things like that. It's things like the fact that whatever we want to say about the Soviet period, it provided a kind of leveling degree of social protection to everybody. So like you doesn't matter what you did in your life, you'd get a pension at the end of it. Not something that all British people can really look forward to, right? You would be looked after. You would have a national health service. Again, a fact that we can't say about all countries, right? These kind of things. And these are things that I bundle as social infrastructure. Things that make it a nice experience to live in a country like Britain is the fact that we have social infrastructure. And Russians are really, really, really unhappy about that, because despite all the oil growth that fueled Putin and Putinism in the early noughties, that didn't really trickle through to ordinary people's sense of their country getting better. So these are the really kind of no-brainer problems that really exercised Russians before the war started. And of course, now it's very, very difficult to get to that because, as you said, Stefanie, we can't really ask questions openly. Yeah.
Jeremy had a very good concept at the start of the war, defensive consolidation. And he very nicely described how sort of the Russian audiences, let's put it that way, gradually shifted towards, let's call it, pro-Kremlin position. Every community shifted in a different way, every personality shifted in a different way, but the key to understand why they have shifted towards the pro-Kremlin position, again, quote unquote, is the issue of national identity and the lack of national identity built after 1991. Certainly, economic issues, social issues, other issues also play the big role here. But after the start of the full-scale war, what really mattered, because when you analyze what the Kremlin is broadcasting as part of these disinformation campaigns domestically, whatever you look at, the laws or the way that history is seen as and interpreted, and just a note, look up who is the guy who's the head of the delegation of Russia in Istanbul these days, right? A pseudo-historian, another obsession of the old guys in the Kremlin. Then it is about who we are as the Russians, as the nation, and what kind of values we have. And here it was very helpful that after 2012, the Kremlin developed and fostered this idea of LGBT as the main internal enemy that is trying to destroy the nation. And now we see that LGBT is officially designated as a terrorist organization, which doesn't make sense, right? And then another aspect of it is all kinds of kind of individual perceptions of politics that Jeremy describes in the book that are very much intertwined with each individual's understanding of where we've been prior 1991, where we've been in the 1990s, and where we are now. And yes, there will be a lot of criticism, but a lot of the ideas that the Russians are picking up in the media or from various communication channels, they actually resonate with them. Because these guys, they often say outrageous things, but sometimes propaganda guys, they just don't say rubbish. They know because they have their own polling. They have their own researchers. They have their own think tanks with lots of resources in the game that help them tailor the message on the media level for the audiences so that this message would then be picked up by the Kremlin so that it would create this cycle of disinformation, sucking in the audiences in support of what they consider as their line.
Yeah, so can I just kind of add to that? Because so that would be something where a relatively conservative society like Russia, where there is kind of a number of people who would generally agree with distrust of LGBTQI plus issues, then of course we shouldn't forget the moral panic, because you earlier said like sort of the moral panic about those kind of the Ukrainian crucified child, but in 2013, of course, the moral panic about adoption by gay Americans of basically
Russian orphans,
children,
Russian orphans,
which basically was the start, and it coincided. So Ukraine is in there. So this is kind of very interesting. Sure. Even though people don't explicitly think about Ukraine very much, or like, so it's not an issue that they really kind of, it's not important for them. But the Kremlin has actually for a long time associated Ukraine with the LGBT issue to some extent. So this kind of moral panic coincided with the run up to like sort of the annexation of Crimea and the Donbass. And the narrative that the Kremlin is spinning around this as well in terms of how LGBT, how basically gay and lesbian people are foreign agents and are people who are kind of basically bringing liberal Western values that are un-Russian into Russia. And by that, actually, you talked about national identity, like sort of undermine Russianness, so to speak, undermine like sort of what Russian identity should be about. So it's one of those things in which there is no clear connection, but there is a kind of parallelism. And that is something that I know in Russian media does happen, right? Where kind of themes and topics are just by the way that they're kind of put together in media, if they're putting in vicinity of each other, even though there might not be explicitly associated. They're put in vicinity of each other.
Yeah. They resonate against each other.
They resonate
and create
against each other.
Create a noise that's much louder than each object on its own.
So, I mean, I do believe that you're right that kind of Ukraine is not an important issue as such.
Well, before the war.
Yeah.
Before the full-scale war.
Before the full-scale war. But the way that it has been framed in conjunction with other issues in a Russian media discourse, that has been ongoing, I would say, since 2013.
It was going from 2012, and that it has a very clear connection to the turn to authoritarianism that started when Putin came to power. And I think it's very important here to say that before 2012, there was a level of homophobia in the Russian society.
Yeah, we should kind of make that caveat that by conservative society, in some ways it's not particularly socially conservative, but in other ways it is. And certainly the LGBT issue is that issue that marks Russia as conservative.
I mean, to be fair, I mean, there's other, even European countries where that's also the case. And where that issue is also being used in similar ways. Yeah,
and just like any kind of post-totalitarian society, where homophobia was actually criminal offense, homosexuality, sorry. So after 1991, there was a certain period of relaxation and freedom, which, again, instrumentally was finished in 2012 with all kinds of first media interventions and then legal interventions. And as we know, it's like they are growing because the life cycle of, say, Russian propaganda is that it always starts at the margins where marginal speakers are throwing in ideas as spaghetti, as if you throw spaghetti on the wall, right? And they kind of throw in different ideas that then become or do not become part of legislation. And then on the basis of this legislation, more speakers, more stakeholders are throwing in even more stuff, and that's where they end up, right? And that's where they end up with the LGBT being the terrorist organization.
And Jeremy, I just want to follow up because you said now ordinary Russians do care about Ukraine. Is that actually true, or do you want to stand by what you said?
Well, I mean, maybe at this final part of our round table here, we could maybe think about the future, right? And which is, of course, Ukraine is now a very salient issue for everybody, again, for everybody in this room, I think, and I hope. But for Russians, because the stakes now are much higher than they ever were before. And certainly, even Russians who were very much against the war from the start, it's very easy for them to then start thinking about how the more support, the more successful Ukraine became or becomes in the war, the more this would then risk potentially the collapse of the Russian state. Now, I don't think that's going to happen, and I don't think that's really what actually anybody in the West is really aiming for. But you can see how then, of course, Ukraine does become this kind of focus of all kinds of anxieties, whether they are realistic, whether they are, again, part of this game, the media, the Russian media are playing, and very, very, again, maybe you can say something about that, Ilya, that this switch, because at the beginning of the war, they really, really tried to say, well, the Ukrainians are Nazis, and that's why we're fighting them, and Zelensky is a Nazi drug fiend. And that didn't really work, or maybe you disagree. And so now I think what's much more effective in terms of the Russian narrative is this idea that really it's not about Ukraine. Ukraine is a patsy. Ukraine's being manipulated. Ukraine is a proxy. It's between us and the West have always wanted to destroy us. And the West can't live with Russian civilization existing, and therefore, it's either us or them. And that does certainly have resonance with many, many Russians.
An interesting ethnographic note. A few weeks ago, I was in Lincoln, and in the very center, I was walking with my family, and we were speaking Russian. And the British guy approached us in Russian. He asked, "Where are you from?" So I had to answer, and he said, "Oh, my wife is from Belgorod." And then she approached us, and we started an exchange of opinions, certainly about Ukraine. And she was like, "Yeah, but everyone knows that Ukrainians are sort of advancing in the region, but behind them there are foreigners like Poles, Latvians, and Ukrainians are saying to the locals, you should run.
Run from the Poles.
Yeah, because when they come, they will be really dangerous for you, right? And I was like, that's interesting. Okay. I mean, it's really hard to be this coward these days, right? When there is Western help to Ukraine. And as you said, for many Russians, that's the evidence, right? United States they were helping them, Britons were helping them, everyone was helping them, right? They are the puppet in a way, right? So that's sort of the narrative that I hear, and that's the narrative that the media projects. But at the same time, let's not forget about the financial dimension of it. For many Russians, especially in the regions where we are most interested in, being at the front line is a source of money. Right?
A lot of money.
A lot of money. And that's a game changer for many families. And as sad as it is, that also creates the incentive to support the regime.
Sure.
Right? And that is a very dangerous
And does
pathway.
that create an incentive to support the war as well? Would you say that there's, of course,
in a
material interest in getting all this money? And that is absolutely the case. Just in the last few months, many more Russian volunteers have actually signed up, partly because they think that the war will be over soon. So that if you sign up now, the risk to your life is relatively low, but you can actually get the money that you get as a sign-up bonus. But so basically, these kind of material incentives then will also influence public opinion. But I mean, because of course the absolute number of people signing up isn't that large. I mean, would you say that this kind of actually really shifts public opinion?
But we don't know the exact numbers. We can only guess.
Hundreds of thousands. Small number of hundreds.
And probably that's also another kind of interesting issue. Like sometimes when you talk about the breakup of Russia or the kind of idea of what could happen to Russia if Russia lost the war, there's this idea like sort of all those national minorities within Russia that are basically non-ethnic Russian that might benefit from this. The people who are signing up right now are often non-ethnic Russian. I think that's still the case, right?
I would struggle to answer that because I don't think we do have
good information, right?
Demographics about that. We have snippets on social media, but these are just anecdotal.
It's kind of the reverse side of what you were saying earlier. There's dangers in relying too much on social media-based research because it can give us this distorted picture. It can give us the distorted picture of what you just said that the war is being waged by these non-ethnic Russians. And that this is almost a form of genocide against these minorities.
That's one possible interpretation of it. Yeah, but I mean, you know what I mean? That, like,
which is probably not the case, is what I should add.
Yeah. This is a follow-on question I had for you about social media. Because, I mean, another issue about doing research in Russia on public opinion and social media is the presence of astroturfing, of basically fake accounts that, of course, Russia has also exported into other kind of jurisdictions, if you kind of think about it.
It was transferred into Russia from the United States.
Yeah, well, that too. Exactly.
And Prigozhin was the guy who actually took that strategy and made it a very lucrative source of power and money.
Yeah, it is a very, very well-known strategy in social media. You can hide your identity. And I mean, I'm not saying anything about how effective that strategy was, but just generally speaking, I mean, in terms of doing research on social media, how much of a problem is that actually in Russia? Is there a presence of basically fake accounts? We know from China, for example, there is definitely a problem with fake accounts on social media.
The question is definitely yes. There are a lot of fake accounts, bots. There is a lot of activities of the so-called troll forums. Yet what my colleagues do, for example, in the United States, they apply social media listening, and they do have various creative ways of getting into accounts of people on various social media platforms and analyzing their posts, and also analyzing local media outlets and aggregating this information, trying to figure out what people are saying. There was always the problem of analyzing social media because of self-censorship, but also because of the fact that the Kremlin and Kremlin-related private stakeholders, again, like Prigozhin, they very early realized the power of social media. And I remember all those conversations about the impossibility of building the Chinese firewall on the Russian internet. You know what? They didn't need it, right? They first flooded this space with lots of different entities, real, fake, etc. And they trained a lot of private companies that then were basically purchased by Moscow mayor, presidential administration, and other companies. At some point, every big corporation or big stakeholder created their own troll farms. And they flooded the space. But in parallel to that, they built the infrastructure to make sure that nothing bad happens in the Russian online space after 2012, because that was the shock to the system. And in that particular case, it became really hard to rely on social media. And that's why it was very important before 2022 to do the research in the field. And still, it is probably the most valuable way. I'm not saying let's ignore that, right? There are creative ways of using this data. But the most precious data is actually the one that you are extracting from interlocutors. And, for example, Public Sociology Lab, guys, they do a fantastic work. Having real people talking to you is still much more important than social media. So whenever you do the research, you really need to balance the two. You need to balance social media data, but you need to have qualitative approach to this in your research.
Which kind of leads me to my concluding question, because we're almost out of time here, which is, Jeremy, you mentioned that you did manage to go to Russia for research recently. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that, like how your impression was, also of what maybe changed? And well, you said a little bit already that certain people were less outspoken, but I mean, do you have any ethnographic insights for us?
I mean, there's so many things that I could say about that, and I could say about the difficulty in the process of doing that, and the ethical problems, and the administrative problems, and the logistical problems, obviously, of traveling to Russia from here in the UK or from Europe. But what I wanted to really say was, I guess, for me, it was really important to go because I think you can guess that after the shock, despite the repression that we talked about, despite the lockdown and information and the flooding of the space, any country in a war, when that war can be kind of held at arm's length, does inevitably normalize it, right? And there's good kind of historical accounts of London after the Blitz had been going on for a while and how it becomes in some ways normalized, even though there's always that effect, of course, potential effect on you as an individual. And so for me, what was interesting and important was to what degree it had been normalized, incorporated into everybody's kind of everyday life. They kind of accepted it in some way as the new normal, and their strategies, their individual strategies, their workplace strategies, their family strategies for dealing with it. And that, again, is a topic that I think is just interesting for its own sake. You know, what happens to a country at war, especially when they are the aggressors, and how do people deal with that in their everyday lives?
I mean, I'm German. I kind of can only speak from like some research on Germany. I mean, yes, it was incredibly normal. Everything was normalized. Like basically, Jews vanishing from German flats was normalized. I mean,
or not talked about, right? Self-censorship again,
Well, actually, it was a lot of people profited, and I think that might be maybe a thing that we might raise with regard to Russia as well. In spite of all the sanctions, in spite of all the kind of predictions of Russian kind of economic collapse, actually there has been like this war economy that has actually generated like sort of quite a lot of wealth for quite a few people.
For some
and
people,
not just the people who are
not
signing
just the soldiers,
up, not just the soldiers, but basically wages have gone up massively, right?
In Germany or in Russia?
In Russia. So that's actually an interesting point. I hand it back to you because you will have more granular information about.
Yeah, I mean, we could talk forever about the whole economy thing, because that really, perhaps in 2025, 2026, if it goes on, is really going to be potentially, the breaking point, the game changer, whatever, that pushes the situation, at least in Russia. There are, of course, like in any war, parts of the society that have definitely done really, really well over and above these rather foolish people that have decided to risk their lives for what is, in British terms, not a lot of money, but in Russian terms, it is a lot of money, right? It's, more than a year's wages, perhaps multiples of years' wages for a relatively poor person, right, in Russia.
Thanks very much. That was fantastic. So just for background, I spent quite a lot of time in Russia, but in the 90s, Yeltsin era into the Putin transition. And Jeremy, this question for you. What really struck me then was how much thirst there was for the opening up and for contact with the West. And I was interested in your comments about how resonant the narrative now that it's a civilizational struggle is. And I wonder whether there is still some residue of that wanting acceptance still, or wanting to still be part of Europe, missing the fact that now there is this new Iron Curtain. And Ilya, for you, again, because a lot of my friends in Russia are from that Gorbachev generation, they actually tend to be Petersburg liberals, basically. And they tell me they are astonished by how credulous their compatriots are watching Первый канал. None of the lessons of the Soviet Union, where everyone knew not to believe what was on television, seems to have been learned. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering, in like what you were saying about how sort of the main propaganda channels work.
Yeah, we didn't really get onto this, but it kind of on how Russians feel as Europeans, because they are Europeans, regardless of what they say or regardless of what is said to them by their leaders, right? And so, what your question touches on is that until very recently, if you asked Russians, do you feel part of Europe, or should Russia be part of Europe, at the heart of Europe? And the answer, of course, would be yes, and that is a reflection of that opening moment. But then this also speaks to the temporary power of propaganda, of media control that Ilya can speak about, which is that if you ask that question now, then 90% of Russians say no, we're not Europeans. We're a separate civilization. So my hope is that is a temporary aberration, a kind of a construct, a result, an artifact of the way that the media is controlled and the way that people self-censor, to go back to our question, because Russians are obviously a core part of European civilization. But as we said also in the talk, the whole idea of civilizations at war has been weaponized by this conflict and is kind of quite effectively as well, unfortunately.
It's quite interesting that your respondents, your friends from the liberal circles, criticize the product of the liberal wave of Gorbachev's policies. Because all those channels, all those elites that fostered and run those media corporations, they started their careers, and they probably are part and parcel of the same liberal intellectual circles of Leningrad and Moscow that began their career, were liberals like Kisilov, for example, right? Then found a way out of this circle, joined the strong party, which in 2000 evidently was Vladimir Putin and the Kremlin, made the right bet and now profit from that, right? And the liberals are sort of saying, how did that happen? The question would be, right, if that was allowed to happen, whom to blame? The audiences that trusted journalists like their own parents in the 80s, because journalists were heroes. Journalists were the vanguard of democratization in the late 1980s and 1990s, but then for some reason they lost all ethical manners and started destroying their opponents, their colleagues. I had wonderful also the note from the field when I was writing an article about the 1990s media, and I was asking various journalists who worked at the time, so imagine ITV and Channel 4 sit in the same building, but they're owned by two rival oligarchs that fight for, let's say, one big company, infrastructural company. And they have media outlets under control, and each evening at News at 9, News at 10, they basically destroy each other, right, in their programs. But then once the programs are over, they go to the bar in the same building, two companies. They meet at the same bar. They have food. They have drinks. Then going back to their offices next day, and producing the same kind of propaganda. That's what was happening in the 1990s, right? That the time which many liberals quite rightly consider the best time in their lives. Look, I also remember the 1990s. It was fun, but it was not that much fun, right? And then somehow, after the 1990s came the 2000s, and these guys from the KGB run the party, and they're like, yeah, okay, right, they pay good money. It's a good way to make a career, to buy a few houses here and there, and also send my children to the nice school. And then somehow you dropped out of the game. Somehow you find yourself on the oppositional channel with less money and less interest and no ethical standards whatsoever. And then if you also ask, not your friends, right, but also kind of various people who sort of share oppositional values, various things about imperialist views, about who is going to be running Russia, very often they might give you absolutely astonishing answers. I think it's a vicious circle. I think it's just the wrong part of the globe, and you really need to run from there, right? But it's not, right? But sometimes it's super depressing.
Hiya. I was just wondering, how exactly would you say that you maximize the potential of using social media to get an idea of what ordinary Russians are thinking while maintaining a kind of critical reflection on what they're saying?
Well, yeah, as we said during the talk, in some ways you can't. And I mean, I'm much more critical than perhaps Ilya would be, right? But a lot of what I'm saying in this book and in my work is that, okay, we can learn something, but we're probably not even sure what that something is from looking at social media. And it can only be interpreted in triangulation with other sources, which for me would be, okay, Ivan, you wrote that you think that Ukrainians should be exterminated on your Facebook, equivalent of Facebook in Russia. Why did you do that? And he might say, because I think Ukrainians are bad, right? Or he might say, because I was drunk. Or he might say, well, because I'm actually quite scared of something else that I said that was against the government, and I thought I would overcompensate that way. So, there could be crazy reasons for people writing stuff. I mean, let's face it, people write some really weird shit on Facebook at the best of times, right? So there's a big problem with just relying on social media. Of course, I think you can triangulate it. And actually, that's, again, a perhaps relatively unusual method that I use. I kind of we call it connective ethnography, where you're connecting with people through social media, but you're also connecting with them in real life to kind of find out to what degree does their social media profile reflect their actual reality, of course, as much as there is an actual reality.
Thank you for that discussion. I just had a question about the changed global opinion, in terms of the political elite since Trump's election. It is the entire U.S. government that's parroting the Kremlin's rhetoric at times, and you've had these far-right parties everywhere coming up and saying, it's too much pro-Ukraine. And just today you had a presidential candidate win Poland who's not exactly pro-Russia, but who's not pro-Ukraine either. How is that being presented domestically by the Russian government? Do you think that's having an effect on how ordinary Russians look at the war? And do they think, well, if the US president doesn't think we are that wrong, maybe our government's position isn't that bad?
First of all, there is the so-called the alliance of the global South against the United States is very much a stronger narrative domestically in Russia. Because especially in 2022, a very big deal was isolation. And probably a lot of people on all levels of society, including the government, were very much afraid to be isolated. So throughout the 2022, they sorted this out as an economic and infrastructural thing. But also the task for domestic propaganda was to demonstrate that we are not isolated, and we do have some evidence that shows that various computational propaganda efforts were done by Moscow on Twitter, back then it was Twitter, to demonstrate that India is with Russia, Africa is with Russia, Latin America was with Russia, And a lot of, since RT was blocked in Europe and elsewhere, they quickly changed the strategy. But domestically, it was also important to demonstrate that, you know what, people are still coming to Russia. Probably we shouldn't really think too much about Europeans and Americans. Who really cares about them? Most of the money are in the global south, so let's create this, what was that, Universiade, and then the BRICS summit in Kazan. But politically, it was also important to show that politicians from all over the world come to greet Vladimir Putin and visit Russia, and Russia is not in isolation. And another aspect to your question is, just like for the Russians, let's say the Crimea or Ukraine, it's not actually about Ukraine, right? It's an imagined entity. In a way, it's a focal point from all kinds of troubles that bother people in their daily life. And propaganda serves them that as the way to channel their frustrations. So in the same way, for Trump or for far-right in Europe or elsewhere, Ukraine and the war in Ukraine, it's not about the war in Ukraine. It's about something else. That, for example, the elites would like to push. The arms problem, the arms race, and these whole notions that, in America, for example, during the election, we are paying so much money to Ukraine, we should stop that, right? Do you really know? Did you really know that? Of course not, right? But that was served to basically destroy the reputation, it might be argued, but to character assassinate, as we say, Biden and his administration. And then Trump keeps on doing that. But elsewhere in Europe, it's the same, right? For Alternative for Germany, the same approach, right? But focused on Ukrainian refugees. Elsewhere in European countries, it's the same, right? It's not about Ukraine as the nation, Ukraine as the country. It is about something else. And that is the element of propaganda for those domestic governments and those domestic stakeholders.
At the beginning, all of you said a number of times, we don't know what Putin thinks, we don't know what he thinks. But we do know what he thinks because he wrote an essay telling us what he was going to do. The problem is we didn't believe him because we live in a post-ideological world. Politics is managerial, it's technocratic. People have forgotten how to argue on the basis of first principles. Anyone under the age of 60 or 70 doesn't really remember a major European leader with a strong sense of conviction. We don't know how to counter ideologues.
People can have different views. But my view is that, Putin did write it down. Putin does clearly believe certain things. But I don't think really he's a strong ideologue. I think that's almost, again, a construction that we've come to as a result of all of these different things that have happened. Because, again, you don't have to go very far back to find him being incredibly inconsistent in what he said, kind of fusing together in a rather postmodern way very, very different ideas about the past, about Russia's past, and again, very, very recently saying, we are Europeans. And then he changed his mind. So I think it's a mistake to say that Putin really holds strong views about anything, really. One of the things that is a problem with the coverage that we get in the West is that it doesn't emphasize how there's an acknowledgement of the lack of legitimacy in the Russian regime. There's a vacuum there. And yes, these different forays and borrowings of different ideological ideas were this failed attempt to deal with that. And when that didn't work, the alternative was to have a war.
I agree. I rediscovered that article when it was published in 2021. I read it and I was like, that dude went crazy. Just whatever. Because there were a lot of stories about him being in a bunker, super isolated. And at that time, Russian society was showing tremendous signs of democratization, like on the grassroots, because there was a lot of grassroots communities protesting against the government's COVID policies. Yeah. And at some point, we forgot it. Like we easily forget things. But in 2021, in December, imagine MPs were standing with a banner stop, what was that? Like, stop COVID-19 fascism. And the fascist was the Kremlin. And they stood in the parliament. Hundreds of people were standing in the streets in December because the government was trying to put into action pretty harsh strategy for lockdown. And we forgot that. And a couple of months after that, the war started, right? So everything shifted, everything's changed. And we started to believe that, yeah, well, Russians support him, right? They believe in that ideology. But another interesting, very tiny detail, but I think it is showing a lot. I've been doing a research at the time on the biggest Telegram community of COVID-19 dissidents in Russia. There were different members. The guy was actually Ukrainian, but everything was in Russian, and it had more than 100,000 subscribers. So that was the biggest. And they launched in January 2021, so they absorbed all those COVID-19 lockdown policies. There was a lot of content from around the world instantly translated into Russian. But there was an interesting thing. Once the war started, and we've analyzed like the whole months of posts when the war started. And as you remember, 2 weeks into the war, there was a story about Ukrainian biolabs. And that was like a big, big thing everywhere in the world. So we actually looked into discussions, into the posts. Zero information about biolabs. People really didn't buy that. It was not something really relevant. What they really were anxious about, how the new measures would affect them. Measures, I mean, COVID-19, passports, traveling, etc. And
mandatory vaccination, everything. It was super interesting. So my answer would be, when we're dealing with semi-closed authoritarian regimes like Russia, or in a way like China, we really need to think about composite strategies, research strategies, in which we will complement the analysis of really outbursts in the press, right? But at the same time, deep analysis of social media and the critical analysis of social media. And only kind of when we go above all the cliches about what we know about this society, when we start learning languages and trying to understand the culture of these countries, then we will realize that, well, we can actually predict what these guys are going to do. But that's part of the problem, right? We're running out of experts. We're running out of sane experts that will try to understand within reasonable amounts of time. Sure. I wanted to hear from you, Stefanie, about ideology.
No, I just want to talk about ideology. I wanted to kind of reaffirm what you said about the fragile legitimacy of the Kremlin and also the fragile sense of self-legitimization of the Kremlin. And just kind of to add that Putin actually said a lot of different things about Ukraine and why he invaded Ukraine, which is why we have a massive discussion in the West around kind of Mersheimer's argument that it was all the West's fault because it was all about NATO enlargement, because he said that too, which was a very different tack from what he said in that other article that you kind of... So, yeah, we need to be very careful because that has been a characteristics of the Kremlin's communications, that there are very sophisticated political technology behind that, and that has not gone away. Political technology meaning focus groups, you already mentioned this, like sort of basically the Kremlin road testing ideas that they're launching. You talked about this ecosystem with the kind of more extreme voices that kind of amplify that. So all these kind of things are part of a way that there is a sophisticated political communication apparatus, and I will still maintain that we don't know what Putin thinks in all of this.
Could I just ask what your opinion is of the difference between propaganda in Russia and propaganda in the UK?
That's a nice question, and of course there's different ways of answering it. The simple way of answering it is, of course, there's propaganda everywhere, and we're subject to propaganda all the time, and our worldviews are shaped by different kinds of propaganda. Propaganda is just information, but it goes back to a point that we were touching on early in our talk, and I think Ilya perhaps talked about it more than I did, which was this problem when you are in a society where some speech is criminalized, but moreover, you are in a situation where you're only hearing one version of the story from people in your social circle, and you don't know whether that's because they're afraid, whether because they really believe that, or whether because they're self-censoring, right? And then in a sense, that would then encourage you to almost completely buy in to those narratives. And this is a big problem that political scientists work on. Again, one of our American colleague, Sam Green, who's the head of King's College London Russian section, that's his take on this question of propaganda, that if you're surrounded by people that are saying that they agree with the government, you will actually start agreeing with the government regardless of what your kind of inner self has been telling you to that point. And that's a big problem for a country like Russia, in his view.
I would be very cautious to compare Russia and UK in that sense. Because, yes, we might have very problematic media outlets and media personalities and concepts that these media say, but the ultimate difference is, in the UK, you can say more or less whatever you want. You might get into trouble, but there is a huge amount of freedom of speech. And you can contest your point of view in the court. That's why if you are found doing propaganda in the UK, there are millions of ways to bring this evidence and show publicly that you are involved in that, right? So if you're getting the money from newsmakers or from dodgy companies, or if you are lying or twisting facts, there are ways to show that you're doing all these things, right? And leave to the public or to the law enforcement services to deal with that, depending on what kind of propaganda we are dealing with. In the Russian case, as we said, there is censorship. B, there is huge political and social pressure to take part in the production of, let's call it, bad information, right? Scholars of disinformation argue whether we call it propaganda, disinformation, misinformation, etc. Bad information. But also, sometimes it's just the system that, in Russia, I mean, the system that makes propaganda, or believe in the propaganda, the only way to survive in the society. You would have ended up in the police after that for asking that particular question. Yeah, so let's be very careful in comparing. Although there are very useful ways of understanding what happens in Russia to what happens in certain segments of the UK society, but these comparisons are not really helpful.